In the gritty borough of Brooklyn, during a time when organized crime held entire neighborhoods in a grip of quiet terror, a young man was sharpening his tools, not just of trade, but of power. Roy Albert DeMeo was born in 1940 into a modest Italian-American family. His early life was not unlike that of many others in the Canarsie neighborhood. But Roy wasn't interested in the mundane. He wasn't satisfied with average. He wanted Morand. He didn't care how he got it. As a teenager, Roy was already dabbling in petty crime. He showed an unusual ability to remain calm during chaos. While others panicked when things went wrong, Roy calculated. By the time he reached adulthood, he was building connections with loan sharks, local bookies, and crooked business owners. He moved with quiet confidence, the kind that came from someone who knew they were destined to rule in the shadows. In his 20s, Roy began working with a small crew of car thieves. He wasn't just interested in boosting cars, he wanted to build a network. He quickly took control of the operation, turning it into a sophisticated vehicle theft ring that spanned across boroughs. The stolen vehicles would be altered, shipped overseas, and sold for hefty profits. This enterprise alone was making Roy thousands of dollars a week, but his ambitions didn't end there. Roy became involved in loan sharking, offering large amounts of money to desperate borrowers at brutal interest rates. When debtors failed to pay, he sent messages, often violent ones, and when violence wasn't enough, he found other, more permanent solutions. It was this mix of discipline, brutality, and business acumen that caught the attention of Paul Castellano, the feared and calculating boss of the Gambino crime family. Castellano, a man who preferred making money over starting wars, saw in Roy a perfect balance, someone who could earn and enforce. And so, Roy DeMeo was formally brought under the Gambino umbrella. But unlike other soldiers, Roy didn't operate entirely under their thumb. He was given autonomy. He was dangerous, and Castellano knew it. Roy built his own crew from scratch, loyal, young, and deadly. Men like Chris Rosenberg, Joseph Testa, Henry Borelli, and Anthony Center. They were street kids, drug dealers, toughs, but Roy molded them into something else. He didn't just want a crew, he wanted a system, a machine. By the early 1970s, Roy's organization was pulling in massive sums through auto theft, credit card fraud, porn distribution, and extortion. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was an engine of income for the Gambino family. The ability to generate cash made him nearly untouchable, even as rumors swirled about his growing appetite for murder. But DeMeo's killings were not like the typical mafia hits. He wasn't killing just to send a message or settle a score. His murders had a different tone: efficient, emotionless, systematic, and that system had a home, a small, unremarkable bar on Flatlands Avenue in Brooklyn known as the Gemini Lounge. It was there that Roy began to perfect his method: quiet, clean, and untraceable. The lounge wasn't just a place to drink and gather, it was his lab, his headquarters, his slaughterhouse. Behind a false wall in the bar's apartment above, a small soundproof room was converted into a kill room. Plastic sheeting lined the walls. Tools were neatly organized. There was even a drain installed in the floor. The setup resembled something out of a horror film, but this was Roy's reality. This was where he worked. By the mid-1970s, Roy and his crew were becoming infamous among the underworld, not for flash or flair, but for their ability to make people disappear. Their victims rarely showed up in dumpsters or alleyways. They simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no bullets, no crime scenes, just voids where people once were. What made Roy even more terrifying was how normal he appeared on the outside. A family man, a husband, a father of 4. He lived in a quiet neighborhood and was known to throw block parties and attend PTA meetings. His children had no idea that their father, while tucking them into bed at night, had spent the afternoon dismembering a body and draining its blood into a bathtub. It was this dual life, the suburban dad by day and cold-blooded executioner by night, that made Roy DeMeo such a unique and terrifying figure in mafia history. He blurred the line between man and monster. He wasn't driven by rage or revenge. He was driven by order, by efficiency. Killing was just another task, like balancing a ledger or arranging a delivery. By the end of the decade, Roy's rise was complete. He had carved out a position of power, not just in Brooklyn, but within the hierarchy of the Gambino family itself. He was feared, respected, and depended upon. But with power came attention, and with attention came risk. law enforcement was beginning to notice the growing number of missing persons linked to Roy's world. The FBI started connecting dots, and quietly, in the background, files began to form. Roy didn't know it yet, but the empire he built with blood was already beginning to rot from the inside. And in time, the Gemini Lounge would not only become the site of his greatest power, but also the birthplace of his downfall. On the surface, the Gemini Lounge looked like any other Brooklyn dive bar. Nestled at 4021 Flatlands Avenue, it had a plain neon sign, a sticky floor, and the usual neighborhood regulars nursing beers at the counter. But for those in the know, the ones who didn't dare speak too loud about it, Gemini Lounge was more than a watering hole. It was the epicenter of one of the most terrifying and efficient murder operations in American organized crime history. Roy DeMeo had chosen the location carefully. It wasn't too flashy, and it was just low profile enough to fly under the radar of law enforcement. It served two purposes. It was a base of operations for his crew's various illegal businesses: loan sharking, stolen vehicles, drug trafficking. It doubled as a murder factory, not metaphorically, literally. Behind the lounge's main bar area, there was a narrow staircase that led up to an apartment. At the top of that staircase was a small room hidden behind a false wall. It had no windows, only dim lighting, and it had been meticulously prepared. Plastic sheeting covered the floor and walls. Hooks were installed in the ceiling. A table, drain, and surgical tools were all within reach. This was where Roy's crew perfected their gruesome routine, where death was a process, not an act. The victims who entered the Gemini Lounge rarely knew they were walking into their final moments. Some were rivals, others were suspected informants. Many were simply liabilities, people who knew too much or talked too freely. Often Roy would greet them personally, making small talk, offering a drink. Then, within minutes, one of his crew members, usually Joseph Tester or Chris Rosenberg, would walk up behind the guest and fire a bullet into the back of their head with a silenced .22 caliber pistol. That's when the machine kicked into action. As soon as the shot was fired, another member, often Anthony Center, would immediately wrap a towel around the victim's head to stop the blood from spraying. The body would then be dragged into the kill room upstairs, stripped of clothing, hung upside down from the hooks, and left to drain. The crew had perfected the dismemberment process. Arms, legs, head, torso. Each part was carefully separated and placed into plastic garbage bags. That then came the cleanup. The plastic sheets were rolled up and replaced. Bleach was used to scrub every inch of the room. Blood was rinsed down the drain. Within hours, there would be no trace left behind. The dismembered remains were then loaded into the trunk of a car and driven to a landfill in Fountain Avenue, where they were dumped among the regular trash. No names, no records, no witnesses. To law enforcement, these people had simply vanished. Roy's crew became so good at erasing lives that even seasoned detectives found it impossible to gather evidence. They left no shell casings, no murder weapons, no fingerprints. Most of their victims had no remains recovered at all. It was as if they had fallen off the earth, and that was exactly how Roy wanted it. In time, the system became so normalized that members of the crew began referring to it casually. They'd joke about doing a Gemini when someone needed to be taken out. To them, murder had become mundane, routine, just another task on a long list of things to do that day. It wasn't just the methodical nature of the killings that was disturbing, it was the emotional detachment. Roy, by now, had trained his crew to think of murder like a mechanic would think of changing oil. There was no room for guilt, no room for hesitation. If someone was marked, the machine would take care of it. But even within this cold framework, there were moments that chilled even hardened killers. One such case involved a young man named Patrick Ololavel, associate, who had been loyal to Roy for years. But Roy began to suspect Patrick had been speaking to the feds. Without hesitation, he lured the young man to the lounge, joked with him over drinks, then had him shot in the head, mid-conversation. Patrick's body was butchered with the same detached professionalism as all the others. Some members of Roy's crew began to show signs of stress. Chris Rosenberg, for example, was once considered Roy's protege, but over time, even Chris started to crack under the pressure. He'd talk to himself, drink more, grow paranoid. Killing wasn't supposed to be a career, yet here they were, doing it every week, sometimes multiple times a week. Law enforcement eventually got wind of the Gemini Lounge's reputation. Undercover agents began conducting surveillance. But without evidence, they couldn't act. They needed a break, a mistake, a witness, anything. Meanwhile, Roy's confidence grew. He believed he had perfected the art of murder. He kept meticulous records in coded ledgers. He tracked finances, names, dates. These books were hidden, but not destroyed, because Roy believed himself untouchable. But no one is untouchable forever. Inside the Gemini Lounge, the walls had absorbed secrets that would never be spoken. The floorboards had soaked in more blood than anyone could imagine. And while the bar continued to serve drinks and play music for unsuspecting patrons, behind the scenes, the air was thick with death. Roy DeMeo didn't just create a murder crew. He created a system of annihilation, a place where death was as normal as a game of cards, where men became ghosts, and where silence was enforced not by fear, but by complete erasure. The Gemini Lounge was no longer just a bar. It had become a legend, a black hole of humanity, a place where evil was industrialized and where Roy DeMeo earned the name that would haunt the underworld forever. By the late 1970s, Roy DeMeo wasn't just running a crew, he was running an empire. The car theft ring he orchestrated, known as the Empire Boulevard operation, was pulling in millions. His network of loansharking, drug trafficking, porn, distribution, and extortion was vast, ruthless, and highly profitable. But behind the staggering profits, the true fuel of Roy's operation was far darker. It wasn't just muscle that kept the money flowing. It was murder at the center of it. All was the same quiet command: eliminate the problem. And in Roy DeMeo's world, any problem could be solved with a bullet to the head and a hacksaw. His crew, once a small group of hungry street kids, had matured into seasoned killers, each trained in the methods perfected within the walls of the Gemini Lounge. Joseph Tester and Anthony Center became notorious for their precision and brutality. Chris Rosenberg, once considered Roy's closest confidant, handled killings with the same detachment as someone taking out the trash. And Henry Borelli, though quieter than the others, followed orders without hesitation. This lethal force wasn't just a side project, it was business. Roy didn't kill impulsively. Each hit was calculated. A debtor who refused to pay, eliminated. A partner who skimmed off the top, disposed of. An associate showing signs of disloyalty, gone. Sometimes, the murders were preemptive, meant not to clean up messes, but to prevent them. Roy viewed murder the same way he viewed accounting, a preventative measure to protect the bottom line. He even used murder as a form of negotiation. One chilling example was when a rival car theft crew attempted to encroach on DeMeo's territory. Instead of confronting them directly, Roy had 3 of their men abducted, executed, and dismembered. The message was clear: stay out or disappear. They got the message. What made Roy truly dangerous was that he wasn't acting purely out of rage or revenge. He wasn't an unhinged psychopath flying off the handle. He was meticulous, cold, business-minded. He made charts, kept logs, maintained schedules. Even murder had to be organized. But there were cracks beginning to show. As the body count climbed, some estimated over 200 victims by this time, the FBI began to take serious notice. People were disappearing at a disturbing rate. Dozens of men linked to Roy had simply vanished without a trace. No bodies, no tips, just silence. Still, Roy remained confident. He believed his system was foolproof. He paid cops for tips. He used burner vehicles. He had his men move bodies late at night, often disguising them as construction workers or sanitation crews. He didn't just stay one step ahead, he built a roadmap to avoid detection altogether. But what Roy couldn't control was paranoia, and that paranoia began to infect the crew. As law enforcement scrutiny increased, Roy began to suspect everyone. He watched his own men closely. He limited their movements. He began bugging phones, interrogating them about small inconsistencies. It wasn't long before he turned on his own protege. Chris Rosenberg had been with Roy since the beginning. He was like a son to him. But after Chris killed a Cuban drug dealer during a botched deal drawing, unnecessary heat Roy was ordered by Castellano to eliminate him to prevent an international incident. Roy struggled. He stalled. But eventually, he carried out the hit. The murder of Chris Rosenberg wasn't just another job. It was a breaking point. It shattered whatever humanity Roy had left. From that point forward, trust no longer existed. Even within his inner circle, loyalty gave way to fear. Crew members began carrying guns around Roy, unsure whether they would be the next to enter the kill room. The Gemini Lounge, once a place of camaraderie, had become a place of suspicion and dread. Meanwhile, Roy's success was attracting more attention than he could handle. The FBI had begun building a case. Surveillance vans circled his neighborhood. Informants were flipping the trash bags filled with dismembered remains, once dumped freely in the Fountain Avenue landfill, were starting to be discovered. Coroners noticed a disturbing pattern. Victims drained of blood, chopped into uniform pieces. They knew it wasn't coincidence. It was method. One former associate, turned confidential informant, described the dismemberments in disturbing detail. He drew diagrams, listed names, pointed fingers. He even revealed that Roy had kept ledgers of every deal, possibly even every murder. The net was closing in. In the midst of all this, Roy made one critical mistake. He began to believe in his own legend. He thought he was untouchable, too valuable to be taken down. He believed that because he generated so much money for Castellano, the boss would protect him no matter the heat. But Castellano wasn't looking at the money anymore. He was looking at the bodies. The Gemini crew had become a liability. The irony was cruel. Roy's greatest strength, his ability to make people disappear, was now the very thing that would bring him down. As the FBI's case grew stronger, as the bodies stacked up, as his crew fractured under the weight of their own crimes, Roy found himself surrounded. He had killed so many people to protect his business that he had forgotten the business had rules, unspoken but deadly. And rule number one was simple: you don't bring heat to the family. Roy DeMeo had done just that, and now, the same system he had created, the same murder machine that had made him powerful, was beginning to turn against him. In the brutal hierarchy of the American Mafia, reputation was everything, but discretion was king. A soldier who made noise, drew heat, or endangered the larger structure of the family was not a soldier for long. By the early 1980s, Roy had crossed a line that no amount of profit could justify. His crew had become too violent, too reckless. Their killing machine, once admired for its efficiency, was now a source of deep concern. Bodies, or at least rumors of them, were starting to leak out into the public sphere. Law enforcement was circling. The press was sniffing around, and Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino crime family, was worried. At first, Castellano had protected Roy. After all, Roy was a moneymaker. His car theft operation alone generated more than $30 million a year. But by 1982, that protection was faltering. Roy wasn't just another earner anymore, he was a liability. His murder count was estimated to be over 200, possibly even 300. The Gemini Lounge was no longer just a hideout, it was a beacon of death, and everyone in law enforcement knew it. The FBI even nicknamed his crew the Murder Machine. Castellano feared that if Roy were arrested, he might flip. The man had too much knowledge, too many secrets, and the idea of him sitting in a federal courtroom, whispering those secrets into a microphone, was unthinkable. So, Castellano did what mafia bosses have done for generations. He ordered the problem to be eliminated. But this wasn't going to be simple. Roy wasn't just another associate. He was paranoid, heavily armed, and unafraid to use violence on anyone, including his own men. His inner circle was shrinking. He no longer trusted anyone fully. He slept with a gun under his pillow. He would often disappear for days, driving through Brooklyn alone at night, shotgun across his lap, scanning the shadows. When word came down from Castellano, it wasn't delivered with subtlety. It was made clear to the remaining members of Roy's crew: kill him, or you're next. The order sent shockwaves through the Gemini crew. They had spent over a decade under Roy's command. They had killed for him, with him, because of him. Some of them, like Joe Testa and Anthony Center, owed their entire criminal careers to DeMeo. But the Mafia doesn't tolerate sentiment. It rewards obedience. And so, reluctantly, they began to plan their leader's execution. Roy sensed the walls closing in. He knew he had made enemies, but he never believed his own crew would betray him. He thought the years of loyalty, the blood they had spilled together, would shield him. But Roy had underestimated just how deeply fear runs in the Mafia. Self-preservation always comes first. In early January 1983, Roy received a call from someone he trusted as set up. He was told there was a meeting about one of their car operations. Routine, nothing suspicious. Roy, ever cautious, brought his usual arsenal with him: a .38 revolver tucked in his belt, a knife in his boot. He even wore a bulletproof vest under his coat, but it wouldn't be enough. He arrived at the designated location, a garage in Long Island. He walked in casually, the way he had done hundreds of times before. Inside were a few members of his crewmen he had killed alongside, laughed with, trusted. What happened next was quick, efficient, cold, just like Roy had trained them. The first shot hit him in the chest, the next in the face. Multiple shots followed. Some say he didn't go down right away, that he reached for his gun, even as his body was failing him. Others say he never saw it coming. But when it was over, Roy DeMeo lay dead on the concrete floor. His body was wrapped in a tarp and stuffed into the trunk of his own car. The car was driven to a quiet neighborhood and left parked on a desolate stretch of Bay Parkway in Brooklyn. It remained there for over a week before the stench drew attention. When police opened the trunk, they found Roy DeMeo, frozen stiff, riddled with bullet wounds. His body had been there so long, it had literally frozen in place, arms locked in, a twisted position, mouth slightly open, as if surprised. Even in death, Roy looked unrelenting. The discovery made headlines. Law enforcement agents who had chased him for years stood over the body in silence. Some felt relief. Others felt something darker, because while Roy was gone, the damage he had done was permanent. The Gemini Lounge didn't shut down overnight, but its reputation was ruined. The killings stopped. The crew splintered. Some members were arrested. Others went into hiding. The FBI began collecting testimony. Indictments followed. Courtrooms were flooded with grisly details, dismemberments, drainings, killings done in broad daylight. It was as if the entire machine Roy had built was suddenly exposed for the monster it truly was. But Roy never faced trial, never gave testimony, never turned informant. In the twisted code of the Mafia, he died honorably, silent to the end. Yet there's a strange irony to it all. For a man who dedicated his life to making people disappear, who engineered murder into an art form, his own death was very public. The final act of the Gemini Lounge Butcher wasn't a vanishing, it was a spectacle, a message. Even the deadliest men can be erased. Roy DeMeo's body may have frozen in the trunk of his car, but the terror he created didn't die with him. His death in 1983 marked the end of an era, yet what he left behind was more than just a blood-soaked history. It was a blueprint for mechanized murder, a legacy of fear that still echoes through the dark corridors of organized crime to this day. The Gemini Lounge was shuttered not long after his death. The neighborhood changed. The music stopped. The plastic was peeled off the walls. The false panel behind the bar was torn down. To outsiders, it became just another abandoned property in Brooklyn. But for those who knew, those who had walked through those doors, who had seen what went on behind the facade, it would never be forgotten. The floorboards had soaked up too much blood. The silence in that place was too heavy. It was haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. Law enforcement agencies, armed with new momentum after DeMeo's assassination, began dismantling his empire. Informants came forward, some willingly, others under threat of life sentences. Names were named, bodies were counted, or at least estimated. The term "the murder machine" wasn't just a media creation. It was a phrase used internally by agents and prosecutors who had never seen anything like what DeMeo had constructed. The numbers were staggering. While official estimates vary, some FBI reports suggest that Roy DeMeo and his crew were responsible for anywhere from 100 to 300 murders between the early 1970s and his death. That number, of course, will never be verified. Too many of the bodies were dismembered, incinerated, or dumped where no one would ever find them. In many cases, there was no physical evidence left at all, just a name scratched off a ledger, a whisper from a street corner, a mother who stopped getting phone calls from her son. What made Roy's legacy even more chilling was the level of normalization within the crew. The murder process became so routine that it was referred to like a maintenance task. Crew members could casually joke about doing a Gemini or cleaning up a situation. Over time, they spoke about murder the way a mechanic might talk about changing oil. The emotional detachment became part of the job description. Roy DeMeo didn't just kill people, he dehumanized the act itself. He stripped it of anger, of motive, of passion. He turned murder into a formula, a profit center, and in doing so, he blurred the line between gangster and serial killer in a way few others in the Mafia ever had. Even the most hardened mobsters were disturbed by what Roy and his crew had done. In many ways, his methods were considered too extreme even for the Mafia group, not exactly known for restraint. But perhaps the most disturbing part of his legacy wasn't the murders, was how long he got away with them. For years, Roy operated right under law enforcement's nose. He lived in a quiet neighborhood. He hosted backyard barbecues. He took his kids to school, all while orchestrating one of the most violent killing sprees in American history. He managed to compartmentalize his life so completely that even his own family claimed they never suspected. A thing his children remembered: a loving father, present and kind. His neighbors described him as polite, low-key, and generous. Meanwhile, in secret rooms above the Gemini Lounge, he was gutting bodies and feeding them into garbage bags. It forced investigators and the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it mows the lawn next to yours. The aftermath of Roy's death saw a slow but steady unraveling of the Gemini crew. Joseph Tester and Anthony Center were eventually convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. Other associates faced similar fates. Some flipped and testified in court. Others disappeared, likely victims of the same system they had helped operate. The fall of DeMeo's empire became one of the most significant blows to the Gambino crime family in the 1980s, but even in prison, the whispers didn't stop. New inmates heard stories about the Gemini Lounge. Young gangsters studied DeMeo's structure not to emulate it, necessarily, but to understand how far the mafia could go before it started eating itself alive. Roy DeMeo became a cautionary tale, both inside the mob and out. To some, he was a symbol of what happens when greed and power outgrow loyalty. To others, he was a reminder of how easily a system designed for profit can become addicted to blood. Over the years, television specials, documentaries, and books would revisit the story. The name Roy DeMeo would come to symbolize cold-blooded efficiency in murder. Even Hollywood took inspiration from his life. Characters in mob movies were loosely based on him: smiling men with kind eyes and monstrous habits. The Gemini Lounge itself, now long gone, still exists in the minds of locals who remember. Some say the block still feels off, that there's something in the air, that no matter how many times the building was painted over, you could never quite erase the truth of what happened inside, because at its core, the story of Roy DeMeo isn't just about crime. It's about how a man can rationalize evil, how he can turn murder into routine, how he can teach others to follow in his footsteps until there's no emotion left, only survival. And in that way, Roy DeMeo did something far more terrifying than just kill people. He industrialized death.